Welcome to The Pause, the key to wisdom, hosted by The Kitchen Table, where we explore ways to respond wisely to life's challenges. If you're looking for ways to navigate life with more maturity, empathy, and insight, you've come to the right place. In our work together, we've discovered a formula for wisdom. It's a do-it-yourself project, so pull up a chair with your co-hosts Greg Coughlin, Ron Medved, and Dave Dirksen as we share our models, practical exercises, and many good stories. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the kitchen table, everyone, and to our exploration of the power of the pause in wise responses. In episode 3 today, we're going to attempt to describe what that process looks like on the positive side. We're going to identify the solution. Last time in episode 2, we talked a lot about some of the troubles that occur when you don't take a pause between stimulus and response, and described some of what's going on and why it's so difficult actually to take that helpful pause, that powerful constructive pause between any stimulus and how you respond. And today we're going to actually describe what it looks like, and we're not going to get into all of the core wisdom formula and the 4 constructs until next time, but just know that those are at play as we describe examples of wise response today. So welcome, Greg and Ron. How are you? And do you want to say anything as an introduction before we get started?
Ron?
Well, I'm just hello, everybody. In real time as we make this program. I mean, I'm in Mexico on holiday, and so is Greg. Actually, we saw each other yesterday. We drove.
Just a minute, Ron. I got to turn down. I got to close the doors. Those annoying waves. The waves rushing up against are getting in the way, and Dave's combating snowblowers, so I'm feeling pretty lucky.
Yeah, I got a rooster or two to throw in too if we need a chorus.
Yeah, that's great, you guys. And we're all in our happy place because I love winter here in Saskatchewan, and we got 5 centimeters of snow. The skiing's going to be amazing. And I was out getting my free exercise. Didn't have to go to the gym today, moving the snow. So
there you go.
Welcome. So yeah, today we're talking about identifying the antidote to reactive, knee-jerk kinds of unhelpful responses to kinds of stimulus that demand us to be a little bit more thoughtful. And so today we're going to describe or give examples of what that pause looks like in action. So I know Ron and Greg, you've both got great examples. So Greg, maybe I'll throw it over to you for the first of those examples.
Yeah. Well, I think, what happened when we were going through the process of discovering the formula, when we were looking at experience, knowledge, maturity, and wisdom, I could look back at stories that I had seen and experienced, and they would fit into the formula. But also what I was sort of my quest was how to enrich the space between the stimulus and response with wise action. So back in the 2000s, somewhere in that range, I was facilitating a planning session with a group of Indigenous leaders, and they were recreational sports leaders. And I spent 2 days with them. And it was, I got to admit, it was both my immaturity as a facilitator and their cultural norms or something. I couldn't quite get things aligned. It was the old, trying to manage a whole bunch of things going in different ways. One of the things that was interesting, though, at the beginning of the session, we had an elder. And I had not experienced the gifting of an elder, and the elder got up and did a prayer and said some really, thoughtful words. And then he just removed himself and sat in the back of the session. So all day long, I'm kind of keeping an eye on him and thinking, is he falling asleep, or is he attentive, or what's going on. At the end of the day, I didn't feel very good because it was like herding cats. They were going in all different directions. I didn't feel very good, and I didn't feel like the group felt very good about it as well. So just as I was wrapping things up, before we got going, got going out of the room. He said, "Mr. Facilitator, can I take a minute?" And I said, "Sure." And so he got up and he gave them a scolding. And he said, "This is really important work that we're doing here today. You didn't respect the facilitator and didn't respect the process. And tomorrow I need you to be fully engaged." So I thought, holy crap, that was a wise response. And now I know what happened is the stimulus of the facilitation was not going to go in the outcomes that we're going to get. He spent the full day kind of absorbing it and then intervened with the positive response with wisdom. And at that point, I sort of recognized the relationship between wisdom and elder, and being a wise elder, being a wise person. So when I look back on it, the cultural norms of having an elder part of your sessions is so valuable. It was amazing how what I thought was a very unengaged older gentleman turned out to be a really significant player in making and advancing the facilitation that we were doing. I'm curious about, your take on that or responses to that. Do you see something that I didn't see in my assessment?
Ron?
I just think that, Greg, you were busy leading the session, the work group, and you're preoccupied with sort of everybody in the room, and he had the advantage too of being able to sit back and observe, and even though he didn't say much during your session, it doesn't sound like he came to the rescue in a very wise way, and
Well, it was. This is like 20 years ago. I don't know what it was, 20 some years ago, and it still came back, rushed back in as a memory of significance. And why I think it was significant is I heard the term elder in Indigenous communities, and I didn't really know what role they played, and that he played a significant role. And I was just thinking, isn't that interesting? Wouldn't that be interesting if you had an elder in every meeting that you had that just sat back and listened, and then thoughtfully, purposely responded, and so with wise response. So I was struck by it.
Mm-hmm. A couple of things jump out at me. One is that he really understood the context. He understood who the people were. He understood what they were attempting to accomplish, and he was invested in that. And so he was able to give a response like that, a chiding, not gentle response, like, one where he's given them the gears so that they do better. But you can't do that unless you know the context, the people involved, you have relationship. And so part of the, there was a pause where he was reflecting on what would help the group. But there's also a lot of history as well. So, he had done a lot of work beforehand as well. But anyway, striking the right moves has to fit the context, and he definitely knew the context. Yeah. The other thing that really strikes me is that seemingly inattentive throughout. Yeah. But there's a different kind of processing going on when you are really taking in a situation and trying to figure out what beneficial response you can make. Because it really is, and I guess that's the third thing. It wasn't about him. No. He was not. He was not doing that to prop himself up or to score points or puff himself up. His ego was not involved. He was doing
Yeah.
this purely, and it was a difficult thing for him to do. Sit there all day, listen, figure out what's going on, and then make a precise response that maybe could alienate some people, but yet he was doing it just for the pure benefit of the group. So that's what I took from that story.
Yeah. And, you know, the timing of it was the right time. He could have waited till the morning and then sort of tuned them in then, but he did it at the night so that people were sleeping on it. And, you know, we had my recollection may be embellished, but we had a great day the second day because we were on point, on task, engaged and making progress.
That's awesome. Greg, we really
But
mined that story as we were going through the process. We really mined it, and it was something that gave us a lot of insight about the models that developed after. And so I appreciate you sharing that. Ron, in process, you also shared a story that we mined for a lot of insight regarding wisdom. Would you mind sharing that?
Sure. You know, it's a fond memory, though it's probably 30 years old. But I was invited, you know, to facilitate a meeting, a 2-day meeting with some scientists over at the Hanford Nuclear Facility in Eastern Washington. And I'd been doing some work over there in the community for a couple of years, so I was somewhat known. And I was actually working with the local community because their problem that they were facing is that this facility was part of, back in World War II, was part of the effort to build the atomic bomb. And they actually produced plutonium there. But once the war was over, and once, you know, we were down the road a couple of decades, you know, there was no need to create plutonium, but there was this big need to clean up the site, because where they produced the plutonium, they had contaminated the soil, and, you know, it was a big issue. And so it was not only, it was an issue for the government, but it was an issue for the local community. And so I was a relatively known and impartial facilitator, and so they invited me in, and I organized this workshop, and so, but
were you comfortable doing it, Ron?
no, I was nervous, and, you know, but one of the things that I did decide to do is that I invited one of my colleagues from the Pacific Institute, Dr. Glenn Terrell, to join me, you know, in the workshop, and he was happy to do it. Now, Glenn was an elder, again, kind of maybe from the state of Washington point of view, especially. He was a former president of Washington State University, and he actually had his doctorate in psychology. So, Dr. Terrell was well known, you know, among the participants in this workshop. But so together we did the workshop, and you know, I led the group in some exercises, and the goal of the workshop was to come up with a new mission statement for the site, and they were kind of treading water. They got a notice from the Atomic Energy Commission that the head of the commission was coming out in 2 weeks, and, you know, they needed to have a new mission statement, so to speak, to talk about what their work was going to be going forward. And so when there was a certain amount of anxiety with everybody in the room, because there was some pressure on the participants too, because their big boss was coming out. So anyway, I had some really very good video taped exercises created from the Pacific Institute that I facilitated. Like I said, it was a 2-day workshop, and so, you know, we were giving them some new language, you know, to work with and kind of helping them understand the psychology of the situation that they were in. But anyway, it's now the second day. As a matter of fact, it was almost lunchtime, on the second day. 30 years ago, but I specifically remember that it was 11:45, on the second day, and I hadn't really accomplished very much, you guys. I mean, our job was to come up with a new mission statement. We had, I think, one word, that we had gotten some consensus on, and that word was transform. And it was a challenging word, for the group because, they a group of scientists, the best in their field, and they were being asked to change in a major way. And so anyway, Taro was in the room with me. He would consult with me on breaks, and of course, we had dinner and breakfast together, and so he was watching the proceedings, kind of like your elder, Greg, and your example. But at 11:45 on the morning of the second day, my group sort of got a mind of its own. It started. There were 4 flip charts in the room. I was using one primarily. There was 3 that were sitting kind of inactive. But at 11:45, several of the participants got up and started moving these flip charts around, and my anxiety rose. I'm like, what's going on here? I'm losing control of this work group. And so they were moving the furniture around, and heck, I'm the seminar leader or the workshop leader. What's going on here? And Glenn was sitting behind me in the room, kind of off to the side, and he started sliding his chair over to get near me. He wanted to tell me something, and I could tell that that's what was up. And meanwhile, those guys were doing their thing with the flip charts. And Glenn got up close to me, and he leaned into me, and he said, "Ron, I hope you realize that your work here is done." And that was basically interpreted, if I need to interpret it for someone, he was basically saying, let them go. They got the ball. They own the initiative. And sure enough, they broke themselves into groups and began working on sort of the larger language of the new mission statement. And Glenn and I just sat back and watched. I mean, it was, sometimes doing the wise thing is, not doing anything. Being
or
quiet,
knowing when. Sorry.
No, you're right. Go ahead, Greg.
No, I'm sort of engaged in your story, but it was the ability to recognize this is a point to do nothing. Like, just let them go. You got them where you need it.
Yeah, well, they had the ball. They had the accountability. If I felt like I was under some time pressure, so did they. And they knew the big boss was coming in a couple of weeks. So they organized themselves. I'd done a good job of sort of getting them ready, to do this work together. Glenn and I, we sort of gave them new language and got them to exercise their own thinking on the goal of the project. But anyway, they end up creating their own mission statement. They found the words. They actually ran the session for the most part, and Glenn and I kind of watched or oversaw the activities. But I guess the point of the story is, it's just like yours, Craig. There was someone who was wise elder, who was in the back of the room, who was watching it all happen, and who stepped in at the moment and basically told me, your work is done. It's happening, and that was it ended up being a good outcome, and everybody got their end results accomplished by through that 2-day process.
Yeah. What really jumps out at me in the story, Ron, is how you were in a place where you were feeling that your skill, ability, capability, or reputation was kind of on the line a little bit. Like you were still in the throes of trying to, build or sustain your reputation as a professional. And so there's a little bit of seeing the people you're working with, but there's also a bit of focus on yourself. Whereas, Glenn, he was just focused on you and the group. He was not focused on himself. He had maybe the luxury of age or detachment or whatever it is, but he was able to just see outside of himself, whereas you were still kind of seeing that you needed to do something. And so he reminded you that it's about your participants and to not let your stuff that's self-focused get in the way. So that really jumps out at me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And we might have mentioned this before, but there is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. And believe me, every person in that room that was part of that workshop was very knowledgeable, their own particular areas. And the first day and a half, it was almost like a debate, or a competition, where the participants were kind of, from their specialty, they were kind of showing off their know-how, and so it took a while for that all to play out. But when it got down to doing the business, which they needed to find a wise response among themselves, among the group, which they did. It had to be a new creation, and so I had to work the hardest on the first day. On the second day, I also had to work hard, but in a very different mode. I needed to sort of stand aside and I had some help watching what was happening, which was, their creative process and coming up with a new statement.
Yeah. And you also had lots of knowledge about facilitation and about how to work with groups and get the best out of them. And your knowledge needed Glenn's wisdom attached to it to know what was the right response in that moment to allow them to be as successful as they could be. Yeah, it's a great story. Greg, response to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, the stories are like, maybe this isn't the right analogy, but it's sort of like recording a golf swing. And the people are saying, where's he going with this? Recording a golf swing and being able to break it down to find out what you did. And that's really what, when I think about Glenn or the elder that I experienced, they delivered such wisdom, but how'd they do it? And it could have come from experience where Dr. Glenn came from, but it wasn't that. Probably Dr. Glenn didn't know very much about nuclear, so it wasn't about knowledge. And the same with my elder. I don't think he was a sports nut or anything. So the experience and knowledge didn't do it, but there was something about their respective maturity. And so if you look at Plato's 4 levels of happiness and motivations, ego, instant gratification, ego gratification, good beyond their self, the bigger worldview. And if you look at, integral theory of egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, both gentlemen were able to approach it with a different maturity, because I felt my reputation would have been harmed because I messed up. So it was in my immaturity is about, and what was impairing my view of it was my insecurity. And, the elder didn't have an ego. He just had a doing good beyond themselves mentality. So developmentally mature, more mature than I. And so in our, let me just, if I can, where we're going a little bit into the future on this is this formula that and we'll talk more about it. But what happened is, for me, when I look at stories that took place, and I'm now recorded the story, and now I can look at the elements of why were they successful, what did they do, and it wasn't necessarily the experience or knowledge that either gentleman had. It was actually their maturity that then allowed them to put a rise response in to what they were doing. How do you feel about that, guys?
Yeah, for sure. I think the other thing that I'm learning to appreciate more and more is just sort of the emotional landscape that we find ourselves in and how we respond to that. Like I said, when the participants were early on in the session, they were actually competing with each other, and in a way showing off. There was some pressure on them, some peer pressure on them to sort of establish their position, in the group. But as the time went on in the workshop, and as I got to the second day, there was more pressure on me because I was worried that I was not going to be able to bring this to a resolution, and I was feeling too much accountability that it was my responsibility to bring this group together, and I think that emotionally, I was feeling that pressure. And when Glenn stepped in, and of course he was calm, cool, and collected, and he knew what was the right thing to do. When the group started taking the initiative and reorganizing the flip charts, we realized that less is more. Less was more in terms of having wisdom show up, in the workshop. So nobody needed to compete for who's the smartest person in the room anymore. The group shifted emotionally, and we're focused on the outcome.
Yeah. What strikes me is that as we move forward in this process, and next time when we get together, we're going to describe in more detail what we believe is going on in that pause, in that gap between the stimulus and response that allows a wise response, a thoughtful response, something that's well considered. What strikes me is that we don't always have a mentor with us when the stimulus comes. And that's where sometimes we can get into trouble. So I'm kind of thinking of this like you need a little mentor on your shoulder, and that's what our models kind of give you, a little mentor on your shoulder. Just say, take a breath here. Here's what could be going on. So as we go forward with the core formula that you showed just now, Greg, and with the 4 constructs that go with it, they're going to act as your little, or they have for me anyway, they act as your little mentor on your shoulder, just in your ear, just helping you to extend that pause and enrich that pause with all the things that need to be considered before you make a response, if you really truly want to have that response be full of benefit for everyone in the situation. In other words, to be a wise response. So that's where we're going. And I think probably that's good for today. We've been able to share some of the stories that we mined for the insights. That's just a couple of the stories that we'll tell, but 2 really good ones in terms of what wisdom and a wise response really looks like. So on behalf of Ron and Greg and I, thanks very much for being here. We'll see you in episode 4. Thanks for joining us at the kitchen table today. We hope you're leaving with a few useful insights, and we'd love to hear from you. So please leave your comments and questions below. There's more to come, so we'll see you again. Be well.